Um, Ron, so nice to see you. How are you? Okay, let's see if I can get this here. Okay, I just want to. So it's an article called "My Ideal Shul," and let's see if I can share it with you in a moment. Let's see here. Share screen. Here we go.
I'm doing well, thanks.
Oh, great. All right. Can you see this article? It's a little bit of, it's by a
Yeah.
fellow named David Olivestone, who you may know. And he starts writing the following. We'll jump and skip because we're not take too long on it, but I think it's interesting food for thought. Have you ever fantasized about your ideal shul? What kind of shul would it be? What would it look like? What minhagim would it follow? So this is a person who says, I can't abide talking during davening. It really bothers him that there's so much distractions, etc. So he says, sometimes I find myself conjuring up the ideal shul in my head. The inspiration for my ideal shul came from a Shabbat morning davening I once experienced many decades ago at a Brooklyn, New York shtibel. I don't know, Rabbi Green, are you familiar with this? The Kopishnitzer Rebbe? I think we lost it, but yes, you're familiar. I'm not. The Kopishnitzer Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Heschel.
Why not? No.
Why not?
Okay. As I remember it, it wasn't a particularly large or ornate shtibel, nor was the crowd very numerous. But what struck me was, listen to this, a square cubicle that stood near the front of the shul, to the right of the Aron Kodesh. It had wooden walls about 6 feet high, leaving the top open. There was a door on the side. It's essentially a one-person cubicle. That was where the Rebbe davened. The Rebbe would daven out of sight of the Kehillah. He'd have a little box in the front. They're like, you know how now in the sanctuary we have chairs in the front and the rabbis sit there and the this and the that sit there. He would have a chair like that, but he would have a box. So when he would daven at shul, no one could see him. Out of sight of the Kehillah. The door remained closed except during the Amidah. And when he would open it, presumably so no doubt that he was part of the minyan. Rabbi Dr. Schneier Lyman, professor of Jewish history, Department of Jewish Studies, says there's a well-established practice among Hasidic groups, and not a few Rebbe's daven in this way. So just think about the way they set up the shul. That you have the whole congregation, and in the very front, there is looks like a closet. It's a freestanding closet with a door, and the rabbi would walk into the door, close the door, and daven on his own in the midst of the whole congregation. And only during the Amidah would he open it, so it would look like he's still part of the congregation, but he would essentially daven by himself in front of everybody. Now, you could argue about the semantics, and maybe that's something to think about, of the approach of such a thing. Like, I would call it the definition of standoffish, if you have a little box in which you daven. But here's what he takes from it, and we're going to get and talk a little bit about this. There was something about being part of a minyan, yet davening in solitude, as the Rebbe did, that appealed to me. What I dreamed, if we could build a shul that was filled with maybe 50 or 100 such cubicles, one for each member. Once inside our own, what I called makom kavua cubicle, each of us would daven alone, each in their own cubicle of space, but there would no be distractions, because all you could look at would be the 4 plain walls around you. There would be no talking, because you wouldn't see anyone else to chat with. This is this writer, and this is his ideal shul. So as my friends pointed out when I described my plan, there were many, many problems with it, but I tossed them off with the unencumbered zeal of a dreamer. Halachic challenges were thrown at me, but it's a fantasy. Okay, fine. I carried this vision with me for many years, retreating into it whenever my neighbors in shul caused me some annoyance or other. But one of the ways that social distancing necessitated by the COVID pandemic affected me, that not only was my ideal shul just a dream, it was no way ideal. Because at the beginning, he said, I was alone in my room with my computer, Zoom davening. There was no one close by. But even when the outdoor minyanim became permissible in courtyards and gardens, the strict limit on the numbers of people who could gather in any one group, and the enforced social distancing discouraged all except the most determined kibitzer from bothering me during davening. He says that now we have COVID. That's the kind of shul we have to build. Everybody's got to be socially distanced. Everybody's got to be far away, either on a computer, or even if you're in the building or in the courtyard or in the Jacob's garden, you're separate from each other. There is no doubt that davening in this way is allowed, at least on some occasions, some level, and it's allowed for greater concentration and introspection. But I began to actually miss the interaction with others. Not the talking during shul, of course, but the fraternity of joining in responses together with those seated right next to me. The sharing of a slightly raised eyebrow if the chazan went off key or mispronounced a word. All right. I came to realize that there's an enormous value in having the same familiar and valued friends around you, whose fellowship you trust to help carry your tefillot. And Hillel did not say al tifrosh ben hatzibur lightly, because the tzibur, the community, has tremendous value. When he quotes Rabbi Wein, right? Okay, I just want to add one interesting piece. This, if you can see it, is a picture of the writers' shul. Here, you see somebody, they're outdoors, they're in a playground, they're raising the Torah, if you can see here in the corner. I don't know if you can see on your screen. And right here in the middle is Dr. Rabbi Posy, my dad, who's in the picture. That's my father. But the article is making the following point.
Right.
That prayer is not simply something that we say, but it is meant to be an experience. It's meant to be an experience. And so what he writes about is that, sometimes part of the experience, he was a person frustrated by talking during davening. All right, it's a thing that is much ink has been spilled on the issue of talking during davening. But he said, you know what? I built an ideal shul where we're all socially distanced. It's great. No one's anywhere near each other. What a great shul. Everybody's together in isolation, right? Whether it's socially distanced by a computer. You can't talk in davening when you have Zoom davening because the host, who's the chazan, will just mute everybody. So you don't if you have Zoom davening. Or if you're, able to go to a socially distanced outdoor service, again, you can't whisper to somebody, hey, what'd you think of this? What'd you think of the ball game? What'd you think of the stock market? Because everybody's 6 feet away from you at least. So he said that it was like, voila, my ideal shul. No one's going to talk to me during shul. And then he came to that notion of saying, you know what? But being together, having the fraternity, the concept of the tzibur is missing something. And if you don't have it. And I want to perhaps argue that is a fascinating point to delve into. Is a socially distanced shul an ideal? That's the question that we can think of. You may say it probably makes davening more appropriate because we have a natural Yetzer Hara, so to speak, a natural inclination that we kibitz during davening. That's what we are. We're Jews. Whether right or wrong, we kibitz. We talk during davening. You sit next to the person and you whisper to them, I didn't like the rabbi's speech, or you talk, look at what that one's wearing, or whatever it may be. And that's probably not ideal, or I should say that is definitely not ideal in terms of davening. But are you missing something by not being able to truly connect and congregate? And so I'd like to try and look through that through the prism of a particular halacha, but I'm interested if anybody has any thoughts of, is a shul, let's assume we have a massive shul, right? And no lack of space, right? Beth Jacob's Chapel Sanctuary seats 800, or 700 something. But you have a huge shul. And that shul can seat myriad of people, everybody socially distanced, so nobody would talk to each other. And the only thing you would hear is the booming, beautiful voice of Chazan Arik Wolheim, belting out all of the wonderful tunes. And everybody could sing together. And it would be a great, beautiful symphony of music. But nobody would sit next to each other. Is that an ideal? And that's what this writer is grappling with. Yes, Suzanne, what do you think?
First of all, I take my Judaism seriously and I want to become a better person. I am not a praying person. I chose always to sit next to Evelyn Goldstein because we would not talk one. I went a shorter time. I came late. I stayed until the end, but that worked for me. And then you can associate. For me, the perfect shul would be one like the new classes in little cubicles of plexiglass, with a break in between the prayers. Now we can associate, come back again for another 15 minutes of prayer without.
What happened?
Yeah, I think we lost the internet for a second.
We lost you.
I think her internet got.
Aliyah Shalom is no longer here.
Yeah.
Much worse.
Oh, wow.
Maxine, what do you think?
Well, I grew up, my mother wouldn't even say hello to her grandchild if he came into shul and she's davening. That's how I grew up. So obviously there's no talking. So, but I like to be close to people. And I think it helps in my prayers and being part of a community, I think is very important.
Okay, yeah. Miriam, what do you think? I think you need to unmute.
You're on mute.
There we go. Go ahead.
I think that most things that we're going to say have ambivalence to them, like there's a yes and a no. The idea of individual cubicles is very unpleasant and very uncomfortable for me. I love to hear the rabbi sermonize. The closer I feel towards him, I don't necessarily have to sit close, but just enough so that I can hear him is important to me. I always want to hear in any shul that I'm going to, I want to hear what the rabbi's sermon will be. Other people are not interested. So we come from different needs. My need is to do that. My need when I go to shul, I'm not a very big shul goer. When I do go to shul, I love the idea of the tzibur, and therefore I do want to sit. And I take the idea of Alter Froshman HaTzibur, I take that very seriously. It's very valid today, just as it was in Pirkei Avot when the rabbi said it. So that we maybe come from different needs, as I just said. And therefore, I don't want to do with the idea of being close to each other. We could stay home and have four walls around us. We don't need people, but we are a community, and therefore we do need people in order to continue with the whole idea that Judaism is very individual, but also answers all your communal needs at the same time.
I have to agree. I think that the idea of having a box where people stand is not ideal, not even close to being ideal. On the other hand, there have been times at Beth Jacob when things were quiet, when people were more quiet than they are now. At this point, they're not very quiet. The shul is very noisy during Shabbos davening. There used to be times on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur when it was very quiet, but I think even that stopped, and it's noisy now. Occasionally, there were times when the various rabbis that have been at Beth Jacob got up and shushed the shul, and I think after a while they all gave up shushing, and it's too bad because it really would be ideal if we could have the davening without the talking and socializing afterwards, which is great.
Right, yeah, Suzanne, go ahead.
Many years ago, I gave Rabbi Top a cut out of a hand like that. And I said, instead of doing like that and saying something, just lift it up, stand up and lift it up. It would be better for his breath. But he never used it.
Okay. So I think one of the things we agree on that decorum in shul is important. And what this particular writer is trying to get at is the tefillah, if we could somehow create a tefillah experience where we could solve for that by keeping people away from each other by 6 feet, but still in the same room, is that ideal? And I think what we're expressing here is the same thing the writer felt. Like, there's something to truly feeling connected and being with people and not having barriers between them. And, what we really need to do is figure out to make sure that the decorum stays. And I wanted to delve into this from a little bit of a different perspective, the perspective of a different halacha known as makom kavua. Because that also deals with trying to understand the place in which you designate or find yourself for prayer, how that is seen in Judaism when it comes to perhaps addressing this issue. So let's take a look at what I think is an interesting source. Let's see if I can get it for you here, right here. It's all in Hebrew, but don't worry, I'm going to go through it all in English. Do you see a bunch of Hebrew here? Rush and Talmud Bavli. Suzanne, can you see that?
Oh.
There we go. You see that? Okay, hopefully you can see my shared screen here. So the Talmud deals with this in a couple of different places. We'll get to it where. About the notion of makom kavua. And listen to the first place that it actually comes up in the analysis of this issue is a very surprising place. Although you might not say, again, we haven't had these experiences in months, but do you remember there used to be a thing called fighting over a place in shul called "You're in my seat"? If you're ever familiar, have you ever heard that before? Where you come into shul and someone says "You're in my seat," and the experience that follows. And Beth Jacob actually has a system in place to deal with that. But the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, says that there was an issue about what's called adverse possession. That places in shul were considered property. And the same way there's something called adverse possession on a piece of property, right? Where if somebody lives on a piece of property for a particular period of time and no one says anything, they can show that that's a proof that it's really theirs. So says the Rabbeinu Asher in Masechet Baba Batra, your seat in shul, if you bring witnesses, in me'idim ha'edim, you bring witnesses, shiashav sham shalosh shanim b'chol eit shenichnas lebeit hakneset, that I've been sitting in that seat for 3 years every time I've come to shul, v'lo yashav b'makom acher, and I haven't sat anywhere else, that can prove that this particular seat in shul is mine. It's considered like property. So one aspect of makom kavua is that your place is, my home is my castle, my seat in shul is my castle. And the Rosh Hashanah says that this, applies to be able to stake a claim over your location, your spot in shul. Now, that generally is no longer applicable for a very important reason, which is that generally that concept only is true when you buy something. Now, while we pay for seats on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we generally don't own the seats in shul. And now that we have a shul with a board and a governance that has the official ownership, there's no individual member who has ownership on a particular chair. Anyway, and Beth Jacob and many other shuls have set it up such that they have set as part of their culture or bylaws or whatever it may be, that we are going to value derech eretz more than this is my seat, and therefore we try to build a culture where people don't kick each other out of their seats. There's a Tshuvas Panim Meiros that writes that back used to be shuls were owned by individuals, or they were owned by people who owned a share, meaning the shul was owned by everybody who bought seats, and then you own that particular chair in our shul. Our shuls are not made that way anymore. And then we have a communal shul, which can decide exactly how seats are allocated. And so, that's that aspect of what I'd call the technical Choshen Mishpat aspect. But let's take a look at where would this come from? Where would it come from to be desirous of a particular place to daven, particular location in shul? Amar Rabbi Chelbo, Amar Rav Huna. Rabbi Chelbo said the name of Rav Huna, Kol hakoveya makom litfilato Elokei Avraham Ezra. Any individual who sets a particular, that's by the way, the word makom kavua. Makom kavua means kovea makom letfilato. You have a set location. It says Elokei Avraham Ezra, the God of Abraham is with him. Why? Because it says Avram Avinu, as it says, Vayashkem Avraham Baboker, Avram arose early in the morning, El Hamakom Asher Amad Sham, to the place where he stood before, Vein Amida El Tefillah. Amida refers to Tefillah. It says Vayamod V'Yinchas V'Yipel. So we see from the example of Avraham Avinu, who set a particular place to daven, and that was his Makom Kavua. So what we're moving away from what we just talked about, the Rush, that your particular place to daven is somehow your property, right? We've moved away from that. But now we're saying somehow your prayer is enhanced by being in the same place each time. And by the way, just an interesting side point, I seem to remember at the beginning of the pandemic where people were davening using the computer and Zoom davening, etc. I have a recollection that there was one of the recommendations given was set up your computer in the same place in your house. And so when you daven in that spot in your living room or whatever it may be, it's it's like a makom kavua. It's a set location. So that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that you're like Avram Avinu if you set up a particular place to pray. There's different interpretations of that passage in the Gemara. Rabbeinu Yonah says, when it says says that's not referring to the place in shul. What it's saying is you should pick a particular place to daven. But you sit in this corner of the shul, that corner of the shul, that's not a difference. It's actually talking when you're davening at home. Shepamim, listen to this Rabbeinu Yonah from centuries ago. He says, because sometimes you're going to need to daven at home. You're not able to go to shul, and therefore mitpalel bebeito miached makom yadu lakach. So what is the Talmud saying? The Talmud saying is when you daven at home, if you want to be truly connected to the way that Avram Avinu davened, find a particular place at home. That should be your davening spot. And interestingly, he says it's not about places at shul. It's actually davening in your own location, that you should daven in a particular place. Interestingly, the Rush says something different. The Rush says, Lo ba'i l'meimer. It's not trying to say here, that you should pick one shul. It's fine to pick multiple shuls to daven. But you should find a particular place in your shul. And what the Magen Avraham says, it shouldn't be that you go to one place or to another, that you should find a particular place in your shul to daven. And the Beis Yosef says you should try and have your cake and eat it too. And so if you go to a particular shul, you should try and daven in one place. Again, Rabbeinu Yonah says once you're going to shul, it has no difference where you daven. Go anywhere you want, because once you're in that locale overall, it's all considered a place of prayer. But if you're at home, you should pick one room one wing, one area, one chair, whatever is your unique place to daven. What are they getting at here? What I believe that they're trying to grapple with, Rabbeinu Yonah and the Rush, they're trying to grapple with the question of how much does your environment shape your prayer? And they're looking at it a little bit from different angles. Rush says it has to be at a particular actual location. The Rabbeinu Yonah says it doesn't have to be in like within 4 amos, and actually that's what one of the commentaries say, that everything is considered your makom kavua if you're within 4 amot of the general place you use, the general seat you have. But what they're all getting at is this notion that your prayer is impacted by the environment you build around your prayer. That's the idea of makom kavua. The idea of makom kavua is when you pray, you must do as much as you can to build the appropriate environment. And following Avraham Avinu's example, one of the ways you do that is by sitting in a particular location. But that's really a microcosm of the bigger issue of, again, trying to make sure that you set the aura and the environment that you want. Interestingly, this discussion was used in a couple of very, very interesting historical examples. There is a phrase, ein aniyut b'makom ashirut, which is that in places that you want to convey grandeur, you don't want to skimp. And this has led to communities building physically appealing and beautiful shuls a communal priority. Again, sometimes we read that article, sometimes the shul, what do you call it? The backyard or the shtibel that the writer was in was not particularly beautiful. But if you notice, that over history has been something that Jewish communities and frankly other faith communities have taken very seriously. You'll go to ancient old cities, etc., and one of the things you'll note is that for generations, for centuries, there was this value of trying to make a beautiful shul. Based on this same discussion of the Rosh and Rabbeinu Yonah and the concept of makom kavua, also the notion of mikdash mat and the beauty of the Beit HaMikdash. But the idea is we think environment matters. The environment you create around yourself makes a difference. It matters, and therefore you should pick the same place to daven, either at home or in shul. You should make a beautiful shul. There was a famous story about a letter written to Rabbi Soloveitchik about, I believe it was the Hill of the University of Michigan. Those who know the details can update. But they asked him about a certain shaila of they were talking about interfaith chapels. And they said, we want to have, they had a particular shaila about a particular decoration. That's Rabbi Soloveitchik, okay, what do you say about this and that celebration? But we're not asking you about interfaith chapels. That's not what we're asking. You're asking about, we're building this type of chapel and we want to know about this, this, and the other. And so Rabbi Soloveitchik responded however he responded. And then he says, I know you didn't ask me about interfaith chapels, but I'm going to tell you what I think anyway. And he made the argument that he was against building multi-faith chapels outside of certain parameters. But the argument that he made revolves around this same notion, which is environment matters and the kind of shul you build matters. And therefore, there's a whole corpus of what's called Hilchot Beit HaKnesset, because the environment of prayer makes a difference. And that, so the issue of Makom Kavua comes to highlight that, which brings me back to perhaps a different approach, and we'll stop the share for a second. Brings me to a different approach to the questions that we've raised. Because what we're dealing with is, again, as Dick pointed out, the absolute primacy of appropriate decorum in shul, and how much more beautiful the davening was back in the days before there was a lot of talking. And I'll tell you now, it's very interesting in that, if those who are able to come to the Beth Jacob outdoor minyan, where we do on Shabbat and it's socially distanced, the decorum is incredible because everybody's getting so far away from each other they can't. they have to socially distance. They can't, stop what they're doing and mingle about. So if that's the case, is that the ideal? And what I'd like to perhaps argue, and I think Miriam was pointing this out, is that may be part of a solution to an issue, but it's not the environment of shul. The environment of shul, the concept of makom kavua is meant to express the fact that you build the right environment that enhances your tefillah. And I would therefore, at least on a personal level, argue that Bezrat Hashem b'mheira b'yameinu, when the whole pandemic is behind us, and it's going to take time, but we should try to come back to a type of tefillah where we can be in close proximity to each other because we feed off each other in the same way. And in my view, a plexiglass barrier between each one of us, I think would hinder from that notion of the connection to the tzibor in the way. Now, we'll have to go through iterations like that for some months to come. And it's not going to be very gradual. To me, it brings that sense of the aura, the makom kavua idea that the Rosh and Rabbi Yonah were trying to tease out to be able to get there. Now, this is actually a very apropos discussion because once the vaccine became more, or I should say, should be, like Israel, it's much more a la para because the vaccination rates in Israel are just phenomenal. But in a time, hopefully, b'mheira b'yameinu, and there's now two new vaccines, which we expect by the middle of February, which will be out in the market. So there'll hopefully be a lot more supply, etc. But the concept of, what COVID has done is given us a chance to hit the reset button of shul. And we hopefully will be back to it soon, in a number of months, etc. But what it's basically allowed us to do is say, okay, let's build something with a clean slate. How should we build it so that we can achieve all of the environment and aura that we want to build? So there are those who are recommending that we build shuls with plexiglass cubicles. And it's an issue that there are some who are suggesting because that will do is we'll have a lot of people in shul. But even though infection from COVID may not be an issue anymore, hopefully that's the case. Perhaps, that sense of solitude is worthwhile outside of just infection control. And there is an argument that's being made in that very vein. Others are saying the sooner we can get rid of plexiglass and barriers and social distancing for davening, the better. Because again, the environment of that makom kavua idea is what we're trying to strive toward and trying to achieve. What Dick was pointing out is it would be great to have the best of both worlds, where we all come together, we all daven in close proximity, and nobody talks during davening. But there are those who say, let's build a shul, so to speak, that'll solve for that, and let's take what the positive that came from social distancing during COVID to be able to get there. And that is a very, very interesting approach. Again, not opining on it, although to me, I think that is one of the things that we should try and get back to as opposed to get away from as we rebuild, post that. The halacha about makom kavua actually goes and takes an additional aspect, which is that there's a halacha that if somebody is in mourning and after they, for example, this is very common on a Friday night. Let's say somebody's in mourning and sitting shiva, and they pause the outward shiva observances on Shabbat. So they'll come perhaps Friday night to shul. And so there's a very common practice. I mean, that what we do is they stay outside for the festive parts because right as Shabbat begins, they're still in that shiva state. And then once we announce Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, that we sort of announce and inaugurate the beginning of Shabbat, so then they, right before that, they walk into shul. The shul proclaims the mourner's comforting prayer. And then, and this is not as well known, the rabbi or somebody escorts the mourner into shul to a different place for where they usually sit. A different seat from what their seat was up until that point on a regular basis in shul. Which is the original halacha that is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch and Poskim, that they, the Breita in Masechet Moed Katan says that you should change your seat as part of your expression of mourning. And there's two very powerful ideas here. The first is that it teaches us another aspect of the notion of makom kavua, right? We started by expressing the thesis that that you know, your placement matters, your environment matters. But another aspect of that, interestingly, is that it generally has that sense of feeling at home. And therefore, when you're in mourning and there's that disconnection, that discomfort, you move to a different place. So there's another aspect of the concept of makom kavua, of that sort of groundedness of sitting in the same place in shul. Now, the poskim asked the second point, which is, okay, so then are you allowed to go move to a different seat because of avelut? And the answer is, because as long as you just don't do a different place each time, then it's not a violation of the value of makom kavua. You're just simply, now you're, when you're in mourning, you're switching for sometimes the full year or for a month or whatever it may be to a different location, but you're not going willy-nilly, back and forth, too many times. But again, the underlying concept here is that you should take the environment you create for yourself in tefillah seriously. And therefore, the Magen Avraham writes that you should not change your makom kavua except for a tzorech, a need. So this came up actually once when I was working in a school, and they had different spots in the school minyan, both for the boys and the girls, that was meant to be that they were placed to sit near their teachers. And the idea was that this would help the decorum, and you would be around somebody who would be a role model. But they instituted this rule to change the kids' seats to be near their teachers all in the middle of the year. So the school, the students went at a big stink. Oh my gosh, how dare you change our makom kavua? Now the kids had all picked seats near their friends so they could kibitz during davening. But and so the school was quite aware of that and therefore wanted to change it to be able to solve for that issue. But the kids all screamed, makom kavua, makom kavua. And the answer is, well, no. First of all, it can be changed for a tzorech, for a need. Second of all, we could follow Rabbeinu Yonah that anywhere in shul is fine. That there's not that much halachic background to it. But the idea was that being near a positive role model is also a value of creating the correct aura of tefillah. And I think that actually goes to Suzanne's point very well, which was that part of the way that you created the environment that fit for your sense of tefillah was you sat next to a wonderful person, Mrs. Evelyn Goldstein, alayha shalom, right? And so that I would add to this same concept of our ideal perhaps is not to have a shul with everybody 6 feet apart from each other. Again, we should try and solve for our decorum issues, and Dick is absolutely correct. But perhaps that concept of being around people who can enhance our prayer by their presence, people who we respect, people who we look up to, people who we feel connected to, the concept of multiple generations sitting together, that's a value because that enhances and creates the aura of tefillah. The concept of the idea. And interestingly, if you look, that's why they argued, and I would say this isn't just about a school, that's why they argued that it was important to sit near your teacher, your school teacher in davening. So let me just share the screen here. I'll see some of these sources. Because the Rabbi Yonah says, where it says, Yoshuv and Pracha Marcel Charab Ukne Lecha Chaver. Shafilu atayodea kimoto aseh lecha rav alecha. Even if you know the exact same amount of a particular person, right? They are not wiser or more knowledgeable than you. You should designate for yourself a mentor. When you study something yourself, you don't remember it as much as when you study it or learn it with others. So what is Rabbi Yonah trying to say? He says that impact on someone is always more powerful when it comes from somebody else. When I just contemplate something or read something or learn something on my own, it goes to a certain level. When I'm able to see it in life, in an example, in a living example of someone else, and again, I'll use your examples, but Mrs. Goldstein, you have that living example of someone to whom you look up, someone that you recognize in a positive way. That is something that you should always strive to build for yourself. And again, I would argue that's the concept of, that's what should add in davening. And this is the Rambam says, maybe you're so smart that it doesn't make sense for you to have a mentor, or that mentor isn't really that great. That your influence just sitting in a room on your own is not comparable to the influence that can be had on you when you look to share an experience with others. And so that, I would say, all comes together to argue the same thesis that I think this fellow, this writer argues in that article, which is that even if we could build an ideal shul where we're all in solitude together, that's not the ideal. We're meant to learn from each other, experience things by seeing each other, be connected to each other, build an aura based on our connection to each other that will ultimately enhance our tefillah and frankly enhance ourselves. Yes, of course, we have to make sure that we solve that sense of decorum issue in shul, but on a broader sense, what it represents is building ourselves an aura of sticks and stones of building of the shul and an aura of the foundation of people around us of trying to connect. And that's why I think it's so beautiful, where it's not safe for everybody to come to shul in person, but you still connect on Zoom, whether it's for prayer or for classes, because we still need to connect and interact with each other. And that's, I think, something so important, so beautiful. So that's anyway the notion of the makom kavua, the concept of the the fundamental aura that we built on ourselves when it comes to tefillah, so that we can have that sense. The Maharam Shakar says in the Merkavas HaMishnah, if you have a positive role model in your close proximity, you will be always influenced by your environment. And if you create a good environment, you will be influenced in a positive way. And so that's, I think, an inspiration about the halachot of makom kavua that really comes to try and figure out as we go forward what should be the shul and the experience that we build.